Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I am Ben Bono here to bring you my second fantasy and the anatomy video. Last time we did an introduction. Today we are going to be talking about the first of our three fantasy authors, J.R.R. Tolkien. Yes, that's right, the master himself. Figure start out with the big one, right? So what are some of the ways that things we need to think about if we want to study Tolkien from a more intelligent standpoint? You know, Tolkien's one of those authors where I think it's easy to read him and watch the movies and have a good time and be very entertained. And I think a lot of people kind of know that there's more going on beneath the surface in Tolkien. But yet at the same time, that might be hard to kind of ferret out a little bit. And so my goal in this video isn't to give you a complete overview of everything related to studies in Tolkien, but rather to provide you with a few of the categories, academic categories to think in when reading Tolkien, and then give you an example or two of where those pop out. So I would argue that to understand Tolkien properly, whether as a scholar or simply as a reader looking to be a more intelligent consumer of fantasy entertainment, you really need to think in three academic subjects. Number one, philology, study of language. Number two, mythology. And number three, sacrament. Okay, let's talk through those one at a time. Philology, of course, is, as I said, the study of language. This was Professor Tolkien's career. You know, for as well known as he is as an author of Lord of the Rings and Hobbit and Silmarillion and everything, that was his hobby. But philology was his work. He devoted himself to the study of languages. And you see this spilling over a great deal into his fantasy work. Indeed, language was the beginning of the entire world. That's what he started with way back when he was a soldier in World War I, was inventing some of the languages that eventually formed the basis of Middle-earth. Now, I think that a lot of people kind of know by now, if by nothing more than seeing the movies, that Tolkien wrote an entire Elvish language. Well, actually, it goes deeper than that. He wrote a number of languages, including multiple Elvish languages and fragments of a great many others. Now, that makes him sound nice and nerdy and everything, and we appreciate that. But it's more significant than, gee, isn't it cool that you can learn a few words in Elvish and that they spoke Elvish in the film and everything? I mean, it is neat, but that's been done a number of times now in fantasy literature. HBO hired somebody to invent Dothraki so that they could speak it in Game of Thrones. So, neat deal. Tolkien certainly deserves the credit for doing it first, but is it really that impressive given how many times people have done something like that? And I would say no if we stop there, but yes, we need to go further than that if we're to understand the significance of philology on Middle-earth. Philology, words, language, are the foundation for everything that is going on in Middle-earth. It's not something tacked onto the world in the way that HBO is filming an adaptation of Game of Thrones, and they want the Dothraki language spoken on screen, so then we add it on later. For Tolkien, language was the basis. And it's the basis throughout the entirety of his work, of his fantasy novels. And you see this in the Silmarillion from the formation, creation actually takes place through the act of singing with Ilúvatar and the Valar, at the very beginning of Middle-earth, but you also see it reflected just in the way that Tolkien writes. Now, some of this can be seen if you just read some of the book out loud and you get to a quotation of Elvish, you'll notice that Elvish is very smooth and very flowing and everything, whereas the orcs speak in a very kind of a garbled version of that, and the dwarves have more of a hard, structured language. And so language keys us in a great deal to the different characteristics of the peoples and characters of Middle-earth. But I think it even goes deeper than that. I'm reading Lord of the Rings out loud to my daughter right now, and we just finished the chapter on Treebeard. And you get a couple of moments where, I don't know if we actually get Entish in that chapter, but Treebeard is speaking either in Entish or in Elvish, but very, very few. Most of his language is presented to us in English. But what I did notice is that if you read that chapter, especially if you read it carefully and possibly even out loud, you'll notice that Treebeard's quotations go on much, much longer than just about any quotations in the book. In fact, it's a very, very long chapter. It's, I think, well over 20 pages. It's not quite up there at the Council of Elrond, but it is one of the longer chapters in Lord of the Rings. And why is that significant? It's because Tolkien might not be presenting to us the Entish language, but he wants us to experience the feel of what it would be like to hear an Ent speaking in Entish. And we know that Ents take a very long time to say anything at all in Entish. And Tolkien wants us to experience that. He wants us to experience the quality of language, even if we are not able to hear more than bits and pieces of language itself. Hence, you'll see the elves will speak in a very melancholy, sorrowful, but beautiful way, a way that's filled with longing for a world that is passing away, that they don't exist in any longer. A way that is all about a beauty that is quickly becoming absent from the world. And the Elvish language functions the same way, with its very slow, deliberate, soft sounds and everything. Okay, so that's a brief overview of philology. Lots more we could say there, but pay attention not only to, oh, here's a neat little bit of Elvish, pay attention to the way people talk, the words Tolkien uses, the length of speeches. It informs everything that he's trying to grasp in that world. Number 2 is mythology. Now, mythology, of course, we understand, it's Zeus and Odin and all those fun guys. And it's no secret that Tolkien was trying to do something very similar. He was trying to create a mythology of the British people. Thus, we have a very British type setting in Lord of the Rings, or at least European setting. People ask, well, why isn't there more diversity in Lord of the Rings? Well, and I think it's great to have diversity in fantasy novels, but Tolkien isn't trying to create a fantasy world. He's trying to create a mythology, and a mythology that would lead to his particular people. And so, in a sense, he's trying to do the equivalent of world mythologies all over the world, which are not diverse, but they are specific. And so complaints of racism against Tolkien are absolutely absurd from that perspective. And if you've read any of his letters, especially his famous reply to when a Nazi publisher wanted to publish a translation of Lord of the Rings, you'll know just how absurd any claims of racism are to Tolkien. But he's trying to create mythology. And this is significant when we think about world building. Now, world building has become quite a thing in fantasy novels in the post-Tolkien world. And a lot of times what world building is taken as, if people refer to that in regards to fantasy, is world building is the attempt to create as realistic a world as possible, but one that includes features that are not present in ours. So it contains its own rules about things like magic and mythical creatures and all of that, but yet it's meant to make that world, with all of its qualitative differences, feel like a world you could actually exist in. Tolkien is not doing that. He is trying to create a mythological world, a world that maybe isn't fully consistent in that way, a world that isn't been, focused on creating this sort of alternate version of our world. Rather, he's creating a mythology that you can imagine people who lived in our world telling one another in order to explain our world. And that's really the biggest difference between Tolkien's world building and the world building of fantasy at large. World building at large is meant to, again, create an alternate world. Tolkien's world building is meant to create a world that looks forward to and explains the existence of our world and features therein. Very significant difference, and one that is often quite misunderstood. We assume that the heirs of Tolkien, for all of the ways that they have riffed off of his material, how many farm boys have gone off to fight dark lords in the endless fantasy sagas. But for all of that, they have very few works, if any, have really managed to capture this type of world building in Tolkien. And so you have to understand what you're reading in Tolkien in the same way that you would if you're reading some of the great sagas or, mythology of Zeus or whatever. It's not about creating a fully consistent world that somebody could actually live in. It's about creating a world that explains and looks forward to that which does truly exist. And along with that, we bring in Tolkien's sacrament, his sacramentality, specifically from a Roman Catholic perspective. Now, I've had the benefit of, as a Catholic convert, of reading Tolkien both as an evangelical Christian and then now as a Roman Catholic Christian. And I have to say that when I was an evangelical, I was always somewhat dissatisfied by attempts, especially by my fellow evangelicals, to explain the nature of Tolkien's Christianity as it pertains to his work. In other words, there's really no question that Tolkien's faith did affect his work. In fact, he said so himself, well, of course, denying any type of allegorical accusation. However, I think those attempts have been, at least from what I read when I was an evangelical, are largely unsatisfying because they fail to take into account that Tolkien is essentially not writing as in, let's put in this Christian value here and that Christian value there, but he is writing a world that is not only mythology, but it is a sacramental mythology. Everything that's going on in Middle-earth is sacrament through and through. What do I mean by that? I mean that it prefigures the sacrament of Christianity. It prefigures different features within the Catholic faith. Tolkien's world is fundamentally about looking forward to the Christian faith. For example, we see several attempts to several different forms of eating and drinking in Tolkien's world. These very clearly, when looked at through the eyes of sacrament, appear to be prefiguring forms of the Eucharist. Now, I'll get into a specific example of that in just a moment. The way that the entire world is alive, anticipating things, this sort of mixture of good and evil that runs throughout the very fiber of Tolkien's universe, is a sacramental quality. The question could be asked, and has been asked, why, if Tolkien is such a religious individual, does Lord of the Rings lack any type of religion? And the answer to that is very simple if you look at the saga and his writings as a whole through a sacramental lens. Tolkien's world lacks formal religion because it exists fully within the religious moment of the sacrament. It exists in the sense that grace is present, driving evil out, that the sacraments, at least from a Catholic perspective, are that which saves us from the evil of this world. Indeed, that which will ultimately remake the world. And we see that same quality within Tolkien. Take, for example, the character of Frodo at the end of Lord of the Rings. When he reaches the crack of doom and is unable to throw the ring in, it's an incredible sacramental moment because it looks forward to the need of Christ, just like the Catholic sacraments look back to the work of Christ. Okay, so let's talk about an example that kind of brings these elements together. I want to discuss just briefly here at the end, by way of example, the chapter, I believe it's chapter 3 in book 3 in the Two Towers, the Uruk-hai. This is, of course, when Merry and Pippin are captured by the Uruk-hai and they are brought to well, they eventually escape as the riders of Rohan kind of take on the Uruk-hai at the end of that chapter, have a mass slaughter and everything, and Merry and Pippin are able to escape. We have several elements in here that bring together these three elements of philology, mythology, and sacrament. First of all, we have the element of language that is present in this chapter. And you'll notice the way that Tolkien allows us to hear the words of the orcs. It's one of the few times that we actually hear the orcs speaking in their native tongue. Now, again, a lot of the dialogue is translated, but Tolkien specifically drops that stuff in there. Why? Because again, philology is the key to his world. That is the entrance point. That's the foundation for everything. And so by allowing us to hear the language of the orcs, which by this point we should recognize as a corrupted and garbled form of Elvish, it gives us a key into the hearts of the orcs there who are performing this task, who are committing these evil acts both in assaulting the Fellowship and then in serving Sauron and Saruman respectfully. They are pure corruption, and we know that not only because we are told that, but because we experience it in hearing their language and in hearing how they talk, and the gruffness and the malice in their voices that Tolkien describes. It's a mythological moment, of course, in the sense that the orcs themselves are indicative of the corrupted elves. So we get these pieces of Tolkien's mythology that are being built in there. The mythology of the betrayer Saruman, as we see the way that evil collides with itself in a very mythological sense in the betrayal of the Uruk-hai with the orcs from the mountains, or the mines of Moria, and the orcs from Saruman. We see that within Tolkien's mythology, evil is only able to hold together very tenuously. Right, and so it's an evil that is in a constant state of collapse, which is a key figure of his mythological thought, at least in terms of the development of his own mythology. But then sacramentally, and I find this to be maybe the most interesting part of this chapter, is look at what the orcs are constantly doing as they give Pippin and Merry both food and drink, and it's food and drink that allows them to keep going, but nothing else. And it becomes a very powerful contrast in the chapter to the way that Merry and Pippin are nourished by the orcs using their foul drink and food that they don't even want to touch because it's flesh, and there's a line in there about how God knows where the orcs get their flesh from. And compare that to what happens at the end of the chapter when Merry and Pippin are able to escape and consume the lembas bread, which we are told not only gives them energy to keep going, but revives something inside of them. And then, of course, in the next chapter, they go into Fangorn Forest, where, as they drink the Ent draft, they experience a very similar thing. And the language is, again, very, very similar, that it awakens something inside of them. It doesn't only allow them to keep going in the way that the orc food does, in a way that kind of keeps your legs moving while doing nothing to stop the dying inside of them. It is a nourishment that begins from the inside out. It is pure sacrament. It is a moment that prefigures the Eucharist and also looks at the false Eucharist that exists with the orcs. We have kind of a black mass taking place there, if you will, that does absolutely nothing, and in fact maybe even kills, because as we've seen in the characters of the Ringwraith, and indeed even in Bilbo himself, the evil in Tolkien's mythos has the ability to prolong but not to give new life, and that is brought full bear in the contrast of the two sacraments in the Uruk-hai chapters. If you want another example of sacrament, look at when Galadriel, as they're leaving Lothlorien, she holds that feast and she gives them the lembas bread and she hosts this feast for them. It's a very sacramental moment of bringing together in unity those who then must go their separate ways into a darker world. And my friends, that is the Mass. From a Catholic perspective, that is what the Mass does. Now, I mentioned, and it's been widely discussed, that Tolkien avoids explicit religious points in his writing, both because he wants to avoid allegory and because religion is superfluous, given that we are inside, the entire world is taking place inside of the religious moment. There is one exception, though, which is the date that the ring is destroyed. The beginning of the Fourth Age, the start of the new year, and indeed the moment of redemption for all of Middle-earth takes place on March 25th. Why is that significant? March 25th, for a very long time, up until just a few hundred years ago, was the start of the new day, or of the new year throughout the whole of Christendom. Why? Because March 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation, the moment where the angel Gabriel came to Mary and announced to her that she would give birth to Christ. It is the moment within Christian theology as a whole, and that specific day, at least within the Roman Catholic calendar, is the feast day celebrating this moment where evil is thrown down, just as it is within the Lord of the Rings. It gives you a good insight just into how powerfully the liturgical and sacramental outlook was for Tolkien, that even as somebody who explicitly wanted to avoid those religious moments within his work, went to great pains to discuss his dislike and avoidance of allegory, even that moment is so powerful and so foundational for him that that alone shines through. So it gives you a good insight into just how powerful the sacramental mindset is for Tolkien. So to sum up, you have philology, mythology, and sacrament. All of these three are essential to Tolkien, and all three must be taken together. If you remove any one of those from your understanding, you will get an incomplete picture of Tolkien's writing, not be able to fully appreciate it, and not fully be able to study him. Those three bits of study are essential to not only learning more about Lord of the Rings and learning more about those fields, but to being able to fully appreciate the masterpiece that is the Lord of the Rings and the significance of what Tolkien has accomplished in that work. So that's all for our discussion of Professor Tolkien here in Fantasy and the Academy. Next time, in the third episode, we will look at George R.R. Martin and issues of history and literary criticism and gender studies as it relates to his fantasy world in Sword and Fire. But that's all for now. I'm Bendy Bonham, and this is the Sci-Fi Christian. Goodbye.